Today on Blue 58, change is afoot on the Packers defense, and there's no other position that will show a bigger visual change than the edge rushers. How will they perform under Jeff Hafley?
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink, and I'm happy to be with you here for another episode. Last week, ESPN did a thing in their ESPN Plus coverage of the NFL, ranking rosters for the whole league. Packers had the 13th best roster overall by their rankings and metrics, heavily analytics-driven sort of stuff. You can take or leave the roster rankings. It doesn't really matter to me. But what jumped out to me was that they said the best part of the roster, at least in terms of the starting lineup, was the Packers' edge rushers. Here's what they wrote. Preston Smith, Rashawn Gary, Lucas Van Ness, and Kingsley Enagbare were the only edge rushers to play 100-plus snaps for Green Bay in 2023. All are back for 2024. Smith, 8-plus sacks in 3 straight seasons, and Gary, 9-plus sacks in his past 2 healthy campaigns, form a solid 1-2 punch, and the team figures to get more out of 2023 first-round pick Van Ness, 4 sacks as a rookie, in year 2. Just as an aside, they said the biggest weakness on the roster was linebacker, the biggest X factor was the wide receiver, and the non-starter to keep an eye on was Corey Ballentine. Anyway, the idea of saying that their strongest part of their roster, their best part of their starting lineup, offense or defense right now, is edge rusher, intrigued me. And I had to sit back and think for a second, would that be my gut-level reaction for what's the strongest part of this Packers roster right now, or even the starting lineup? I don't even know if it's wrong. Even if it is wrong, per se, I think that's something reasonable people could disagree about. But just it kind of caught me a little bit off guard. So if I wouldn't say that is the strongest position on the roster, or maybe wouldn't be the highlight of the roster as I'm looking at it, what is the gut level feeling on edge rusher right now? I think if I had to boil it down to just a quick statement, I would say great talent, but big questions. I don't think the talent is in question here among the Packers edge rusher. Is it their deepest position? Maybe, but probably not. Is it the best edge rusher group in the league? Almost certainly no. But Rashawn Gary is proven with an asterisk there. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Preston Smith is the wily old veteran that he is heading into year 10. Lucas Van Ness has physical tools most guys would kill to have. They call him Hercules for a reason. J.J. Enagbare, Kingsley Enagbare, however you want to say it, has been moderately effective as sort of a rotational depth guy. That's a pretty solid top 4. But even beyond that, Brenton Cox has plenty of interesting tools and abilities. International pathway player Kenneth Odumegwu has physical dimensions that are of note that, like Lucas Van Ness, most people would kill to have, even as a professional athlete. And then you're getting down to guys 5 and beyond there. There are other promising guys on this roster too, or at least interesting guys too. But some big questions in this group too. What's the switch to a 4-3 going to do for these guys? You can go back and forth on the schematic differences between, 4-3 and a 3-4, but I don't think you can get around the just physical difference between rushing with your hand down and rushing standing up. It's a preference thing for a lot of guys. There's maybe something that guys have not done a lot of before. It's something that they may have to relearn if they've done it this way for a while. That was one of the big storylines coming out of college for Rashawn Gary. He was always a hand down pass rusher at Michigan. The Packers wanted him to stand up because they were doing a 3-4, and that's how they wanted their edge rushers to operate. Now they're doing a 4-3. Presumably, they're going to be rushing hand down almost all the time. How does that work for guys? And that's that visual difference that I was talking about in the opener there. It's going to look different for fans. Then where's Rashawn Gary in year 2 post-ACL injury? Where is Preston Smith here in year 57 or 10? Which one feels more accurate there? Can Lucas Van Ness make the leap? Is J.J. Enagbare all the way back? And what level of back is he? The Packers have given all systems go on him. How true does that end up being? Obviously shotgunning questions here, but there are a lot of questions. But I would rather have questions with talent than no questions and no talent. So the Packers definitely ahead of the curve here. But a lot to talk about with these edge rushers and a lot of guys that I want to talk through. So let's get started. Before we do, though, I want to give you a reminder. Patreon.com/thepowersweep and thepowersweep.substack.com are where you can support this show and all the efforts that we do at thepowersweep.com as well. And exciting news, this month, the Patreon exclusive merch is starting to go out to people who support us all over the world. I think all 3 of the 4 things that are shipping out this month are going to international people. But if you support at the $3 level or higher, you're going to get some exclusive merch, including if you support at the Jeff Bezos luxury tier, which is like $1 million a month. I said that in the description there. If you support at that level for any amount of time, I will come to your house and record a show there. Please don't do that. Please don't give me $1 million a month. I mean, if you really want to, you can, but there are much more reasonable levels at which you can support, and you'll get some compensation coming back your way in the form of some exclusive merch and some bonus content as well. Right now we're working through our Let's Fix the Carolina Panthers series, which has been fun to talk about and launch. We started that last Friday and we'll continue for the next few weeks. But there's a lot of fun stuff that goes on there. And of course, you get access to our Discord server as well. So patreon.com/thepowersweep or thepowersweep.substack.com. Choose to support either of those places and you'll get all those benefits. Edge rushers. Reminder, we're going low to high in terms of expectations. Been rolling around in my head the idea of calling these no expectations players. Is that even the right word? I guess in a vacuum, we don't really have expectations for these guys. But somebody could emerge from this group at any position. Guys for whom you're not really expecting anything. I mean, do you call them lottery tickets or bonus players or something like that? That seems a little bit kinder. Maybe just keep that in the back of your mind as we're talking about these players for whom we have quote-unquote no expectations. Still interesting to have around. Speaking of, I think one of our first players here in our quote-unquote no expectations camp is one of the more interesting guys who falls into this category across the roster. Deslin Alexander signed with the Packers on a futures deal in January, was in for a workout during the playoffs with the Packers, signed just before their game against the 49ers. 6'3", 264 out of Pittsburgh, had a .98 career production ratio there, an 8.41 relative athletic score, and went undrafted in 2023, but signed with the Jets after the draft and spent most of last season with the Bears practice squad. That's not too shabby of a lineup or a resume as far as a low roster player goes. Worth keeping an eye on, I think. Also of note, Keyshawn Banks, a 2023 undrafted free agent, played 59 college games for San Diego State, did not appear in a game for the Packers last year. Aaron Mosby is also in this lower end of the roster sort of group, appeared in 3 games for the Panthers in 2022, spent virtually all of last season on the Packers practice squad after the Packers claimed him from the 49ers. Then you've got Kenneth Odumegwu, like we mentioned, the international pathway player. Just want to remind you, 6'6", 259, the big guy, very new to football, but physical tools for sure. 17 snaps total in the preseason last year, really just getting the barest scraps. And then practice squad all of last year, obviously, as he works through this international pathway program. But best of luck to him as this continues to unfold. In the low expectations camp, we start with Brenton Cox. It was one of the supposed jewels of the 2023 undrafted free agent class. It was around more or less all of last season, but not really involved. Played 13 snaps total all of last season, 4 on defense, 9 on special teams. That is about as fringe as you can get. And as a result, pretty low expectations for Brenton Cox coming into this season. Why? Well, basically the same issue for Cox as last year. The depth chart is not getting easier to navigate ahead of him. You still have Rashawn Gary, Lucas Van Ness, Preston Smith, J.J. Enagbare, just as your virtual roster locks. I mean, I would say 3 of those 4 guys are absolute stone-cold locks. And then if J.J. Enagbare does not make this roster this year, something has gone horribly wrong. I mean, you'd have to have an extremely, extremely bad training camp for him to not make the roster or get injured or something like that. But barring that, we're looking at starting the conversation about edge rushers at number 5. That's where you're at if you're a guy like Brenton Cox trying to make the roster. So expectations accordingly have to be pretty low. So how does he meet those expectations? It reminds me a lot of the low roster running back guys that we talked about. there will be opportunities at some point. The Packers probably are not going to go through this entire season with edge rushers run 1 through 4 staying 100% healthy for 100% of the season. So you just got to stay ready and be ready when those opportunities arise, and they will. So I would predict that Cox is going to be around in some capacity. Whether that's a good decision or not, I can't say for sure. But the Packers do love to take their long view approaches to building the roster. We've seen Caleb Jones around now for 2 years, Luke Tenuta around for a year and a half. As the Packers try to get something out of them, they are willing to wait on guys. And Cox, I think, probably falls into that camp as well. And it's understandable why he would. Edge rusher is a very valuable position. If you think a guy's got tools that you can develop, you might as well see it through to the end as you try to develop him and see what comes of it. So I think Cox is going to be around in some capacity, either on the 53 or on the practice squad. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's going to be all season. I wouldn't even commit to him making the initial 53-man roster that we did last year. I just think he's going to be around in Green Bay in some capacity this year. The moderate expectations camp starts with J.J. Enagbare. Last year, kind of a tale of two statistical profiles. His raw numbers were down. He had fewer sacks, though more tackles for loss, but fewer quarterback hits, but better rate stats. His pressure rate was up to about 11% from about 8% as a rookie, very much headed in the right direction. Then he tears his ACL, or he has a partial ACL tear, or did he do anything at all? I actually missed this nugget, but Matt LaFleur said in May that Enagbare actually didn't tear anything at all, that his knee came back clean in their offseason look at it, and they use a full go in their offseason workout. So take that however you like it. It looks like he's going to be good to go completely, uninhibited, to start training camp this year. Expectations, though, fairly moderate. He's kind of like Brenton Cox in a way, except he's never had a big role with the Packers. And after Rashawn Gary went down in 2022, it was Enagbare that stepped up and soaked up a lot of snaps for the Packers. He's kind of in a similar role, though, to Cox in that he's got a ceiling on where he's going to go here. He's got a role for sure, but it's a small one. But I think he's going to play the heck out of it, and I think that's basically what we've seen from Enagbare over the past couple of years. In his role, in the role that he plays, he does a good job. And I think that's something worth keeping in mind as you look at these guys, as you look at the roster as a whole coming into training camp. It's looking at a player in a vacuum, it's easy to set yourself up to have expectations that I think are too high for a given player. It's easy to want everybody to be the 1,000-yard receiver or the 1,000-yard rusher or the 10-sack edge rusher. But not everybody can be that, and not everybody is counted on to be that. The Packers are hoping that it's going to be Rashawn Gary and Lucas Van Ness and Preston Smith that are really getting after the passer this year, and then Enagbare has to come in and give them some quality snaps when they're not on the field. And it's okay to have a smaller role. We got to be okay with that, and players got to be okay with that too. That's part of building your program as a coach, getting guys to accept the roles that they are in and get the most out of them in those roles while helping them to get ready for future roles that you may have for them. But as of right now, as Enagbare starts the season, he's in a role where he's in a second tier of players. He's not one of the big guns on the edge rusher or rushing off the edge, but he does have an important role. So how does he meet expectations this year? Going to put a nebulous one out there for Enagbare, but I think he's got to help facilitate the transition away from Preston Smith. I'm assuming that Smith is going to slowly be heading toward a smaller role as other players ascend this year. That would be my hope if I'm Brian Gutekunst. Obviously, you'd love to have 3 or 4 or 8 elite edge rushers, but the Packers, I think, are planning for the post-Preston Smith version of this position. His cap hit jumps to $17 million next year, just at his age and relative productivity, though he has been productive. I don't think that's a number that the Packers are going to want him back on. So if he is back in Green Bay, things are going to have to change quite a bit. If he's not back in Green Bay, that'll be the reason why. But Enagbare and Lucas Van Ness, who we'll talk about here in a couple minutes, are going to be part of that transition. If they can show a lot, it makes the post-Preston Smith landing a lot easier. If they can't, then you start having tough conversations about, like, what does it take to get Preston Smith back in Green Bay next year? Is that a good idea? Do we lower the cap number? Do we release him and then try to bring somebody in through free agency, through the draft. I don't know. It gets complicated, and you start to think about a whole bunch of different permutations of this roster, but it looks a lot different if somebody doesn't step up and give you a solid second or third option that Preston Smith has filled over the past couple of years. Prediction-wise, I think Enigbari is going to be essentially the same as he was last year. I think within 1% or so of 10% in pressure rate, so plus or minus 10%, about 1% there. So I could have just said, I guess, a range of 9 to 11, but you get the idea. And then 3.5 or fewer sacks. I think this is reflective of how effective he will be when he is on the field. I think there's no reason to expect he'll be much worse than that. But just he's going to be not getting a whole ton of snaps compared to some of these other guys. So I think you have to look at the raw numbers a little bit differently. That brings us to Preston Smith. Not much of a spoiler here, but jumping a little bit ahead. I put him in the moderate expectations camp as kind of the equivalent of what we talk about in free agent season. This is about future performance, not past performance. Preston's had his up and downs with the Packers, far more ups than downs. I think, on balance, since 2019 through 2023, he's been a good free agent signing. But when you look at expectations and trying to build around a guy, as is the case with every player on the roster, I think when you talk about building around a player, it's always assumed that you're talking about around a quarterback, but everybody is part of the building around conversation. So as you try to fit other pieces in with Preston Smith, you've got to start thinking about the future, not the past. I think that's part of the reason the Packers drafted Lucas Van Ness in 2013. I think that's going to be part of the conversation next spring. Future performance, not past performance. His relatively recent performance has been pretty good. 2023 performance was right on par with 2022. And as we always say, I think about Preston Smith, Preston has been what he's been. He's exactly what he says on the tin. You're going to get one Preston Smith. You will have a guy who plays hard against the run. You'll get a few cleanup pressures over the course of the season, a few cleanup sacks, often quite a few actually, because he's always assignment sure and in the right spot where he's supposed to be. But he's a table setter. He's not the guy that's going to be single-handedly producing a lot of pressures. You saw that in his kind of partnership with Zadarius Smith early in the Packers' tenure. You saw that as he tailed off in 2022 when Rashawn Gary went down. He's always been a guy that's more of a sidekick than the main superhero there. And I think as he ages, that's only going to become more the case. On top of that, how does he transition to a 4-3 defense? He's never played in a scheme quite like that. He's always been a pretty classic 3-4 outside linebacker. He drops into coverage from time to time. Whether or not that's a good idea, it's a different conversation, but he does it. Stand-up pass rusher, that's what he does. That's what he's done. What does he look like playing in a 4-3? Do they even make it a hard-line transition for him, or do they let him do what he's comfortable with as long as he gets the job done? That remains to be seen. As a result, I think the expectations fall into the moderate camp for Preston Smith, in part because I think that table setter role is his ceiling now, not his floor. In the past, you could have said, yeah, he's going to be like a pass rusher number 1A. So you'll have your top guy, sure, but Preston Smith's going to be right there, and if you ever need a guy to take over, he can probably do that for you. Well, I don't think that's where he is in his career anymore. He's the guy who's going to be a complementary player. Sure, he'll be counted on to more than occupy opposing blockers. He's a guy who you have to respect. If you just ignore him too much, he will still beat you. That, I think, is very much where he was in 2023. But in 2024, I think that's the best version of Preston Smith that you're really going to get, the guy who will make you pay or can make you pay if you ignore him, but he's probably not going to be beating any team's best pass rusher or best pass protector on a consistent basis. That is fine. That is a good sort of role to build around. I think we just need to have the right sort of mindset going into 2024 with him. So I think he's really just got to match his performance from the past couple seasons to be the best version of that. I don't mean in terms of raw numbers. I think just in terms of availability in what he's doing on a snap-in, snap-out basis. Just be that kind of guy, and the Packers will be in good good shape. I am predicting a slight decline in performance for him. I think he does drop under 10% for his pressure rate this year. That would be just the third time in his career. I also think we're going to see more of a middle-tier performance in terms of his production. 4 is his career low in sacks. I think he's going to have more than that, but I think he's going to be below the 8 sacks he was at last year. Just seems fair to think that he's going to have a slight decline at his age. And if this is his last season in Green Bay, hope he goes out with a bang. He's been an enjoyable guy to have in Green Bay. And look, Aaron Jones showed us that we should never assume anything about when a guy is going to finally leave Green Bay. He proved us wrong a couple times there until we started saying, well, definitely he's going to be back for sure. And then now he's in Minnesota. You see how that worked out. But it seems like that is a fair thing to, if not assume, but expect. Just thinking that this may be his last season in Green Bay seems like a good thing to have on your radar. Getting to our high expectations, guys, Lucas Van Ness comes up next. Pretty solid rookie season, but I feel like he's also almost the exact inverse of Devonte Wyatt. We have been very mildly critical of Wyatt because of his low, what we've called contact rate, the rate at which his pressures involve actual contact with the quarterback, so hits and sacks versus hurries. Van Ness is almost the exact opposite of that. He has a very high contact rate, so he did not have a ton of pressures last year, but he made contact at an incredibly high rate. 50% of his pressures involved contact with the quarterback, but he had a fairly low pressure rate overall, about 9%. I think he actually cracked 10% for the season-long rate close to the end of the season, but dropped off a bit in the playoffs. Partly because of how snap counts changed a little bit, so he had fewer opportunities, but also produced fewer pressures in that range. But I think pretty solid, but inverted from where Wyatt is. So Wyatt had a lot of pressures and got pressure consistently, but wasn't making a ton of contact with the quarterback. Van Ness, fewer pressures, but a high rate of contact with the quarterback. Not saying either one is bad or good, just interesting. Overall, I feel pretty good about where he was as a rookie. He was definitely more involved than Rashawn Gary was as a rookie, which is a pretty good comparison, I think, for expectations when he was coming in. But one thing we never did see out of Van Ness was him working as an inside rusher. I assumed that was essentially a given for how they were going to use him. Given his track record at Iowa, playing essentially as a defensive tackle his first couple of years there before bumping outside, but it never happened. That was something that Joe Barry was really hesitant to do. He did it just a couple of times with Rashawn Gary, doing the old Zadarius Smith. Cody Alexander calls it a spinner roll, but other guys have different terminology for it. But basically just getting your best pass rusher standing up in the A-gap right over the center, saying, here I come, get ready to deal with me. I might rush over here, I might rush over there. It's probably going to be here, though. Get ready to see somebody that you don't usually see coming right up the middle. That's something that it seems like Van Ness was well-suited for, playing inside, even if he's not standing up. He's done that exact role before at Iowa, just never did it with the Packers, and Rashawn Gary never really did it either. Hopefully Jeff Hafley is a little bit more creative than that, but I think that's a real underutilized asset in aspect maybe of Van Ness's game. So will it happen in the 4-3? Again, it almost seems foolish not to, but that remains to be seen. We don't really have a feel for what Hafley is going to do. We've got some ideas, but we'll see how things work out. Nevertheless, expectations are going to be high for Van Ness here in year 2. And why wouldn't we have high expectations for Lucas Van Ness? He's a year 2 first-round pick, 13th overall selection a year and a half ago. Of course, expectations are going to be high. They've got to be. And, I mean, having his nickname be Hercules doesn't hurt either. You expect certain things from a guy who goes by Hercules in casual conversations. And if you've seen any of the pictures coming out of off-season workouts and OTAs and minicamp, the nickname fits. He has physical dimensions most guys would really not mind having in a professional football setting. I think he meets expectations by looking like the 13th overall pick. There were flashes last year. I think you could really see it in his movement on the field. you can see an elite athlete out there. You could see a guy with great physical tools, but you could also see a guy finding his way as a first-year NFL football player. The game is different at the NFL level than it is in college. It just is. You're playing against grown men instead of guys that are still less than 2 years removed from high school in a couple of instances, not to disparage the skill level in college football, but it's just different. You're not playing against battle-hardened players in college football like you are in the NFL. Van Ness has to look like he belongs more consistently now, and he's got to perform like it too. I think he will. I think he breaks 10% in pressure rate this year. I think he has more than 5 sacks and then more than 8 tackles for loss. All of that would be an improvement over where he was as a rookie. Not a huge improvement. Trying to temper expectations a little bit too, even while saying they're high. I think he can hit all of those things. If not easily, they're within the realm of possibility for him. Not unreasonable for him to expect that. So steps forward from last year, even as he enters a potentially new role in a new scheme. And finally, Rashawn Gary. What an interesting year he had last year. Coming back from his ACL, ready to go at the start of the season, but a part-time player to start, and great performances in a reduced role. By midseason, he's a full-time player, explodes against the Lions, 3 sacks, gets the contract extension, but then he tails off in the latter portion of the year. Through the first 11 games of the season, 8.5 sacks, 6 tackles for loss, 16 hits on the quarterback, great numbers across the board. Pressure rate stuff, super-duper high, but really unassailable statistical record for Gary in the first 11 games of the season or so. But the last 8 games, including playoffs, 0.5 sack, 1 tackle for loss, and 8 quarterback hits. Our conversation with Matt Ellison about all things ACL and ACL recovery all but convinced me of my thesis from last season that he was essentially just running out of gas. He did not have a full offseason because most of it was recovering from the ACL, was probably not in perfect football shape to start the season, certainly not in the shape that he probably wanted to be in. And that's not a shot at Rashawn Gary. That's just the reality of time. He did not have time to prepare like he probably wanted to heading into last season, but performed accordingly. Strong start to the year, but tailed off down the stretch. And that is, I think, what you would expect from a guy in that sort of position. But even if we give him a little bit of a pass for tailing off down the stretch there, now there are some questions to answer. Is he worth the money the Packers gave him in that contract extension? Can he play a full season? Can he sustain that production over a full season? I think the answer to all 3 of those things is yes. You'd much rather have Rashawn Gary than not have him. Even if he plays 15 games in a season, he's probably better than most guys are in a full season. And I think there's no reason to think he can't sustain that production over a full season. In fact, if you look at his first couple of years in the league, he really started to come on the strongest at the end of the season. 2019, 2020, he was really at his very best there toward the end of the season. 2021, he gets an entirely new role as Zadarius Smith goes down. But he really played some of his best football toward the end of the year. So I don't think there's any reason that he can't sustain his production over the course of the full season. Just as an aside, I think there is a world where Rashawn Gary is just the world's greatest pass rush specialist. There are things that you just can't do or don't do. But you don't have your however many... I don't even know what his contract number is or his cap hit is, but let's just say your $25 million a year pass rusher be a part-time player. But what if you could? Like, what if you just said, look, I know this isn't something that's done, but what if we just said, look, Rashawn Gary is an absolutely elite pass rusher. Nobody doubts that. What if we just had him rush the passer 40 snaps a game and be an absolute transcendent game wrecker when he did that? There's a level of productivity where that does make sense, right? And based on what we saw at the start of last season, Rashawn Gary was pretty close to that. Like, if he's getting pressure on, for a while there, it was like 30% of his pass rushes. If he can do that for 35, 40 snaps a game, I mean, you're talking 11 to 15 pressures, 12 to 15 pressures a game. That's not that bad. And I know that the optics would be terrible of having your mega compensated guy be on the bench for, not on the bench, but on the sideline for a bunch of snaps per game, not participating in run defense at all. But think how valuable that could be if you're able to get that kind of consistent pressure from a guy. It feels crazy to talk about it, but it feels like something that maybe teams should be a little bit more open to. If you've got this guy who can do one thing really, really well, why are you having him do things that he's maybe not as good at, and which could also be taking away from the things that he does really, really well? Does Rashawn tail off last season if all he has to focus on for the start for the whole season, week 1 to the divisional round, is just rushing the quarterback? Do you see him maybe burn out a little bit down the stretch? I don't know. Maybe you don't. Just something that I think should be thought about a little bit more. I mean, baseball teams manage the heck out of their pitchers because the pitchers are the moneymakers. The pitchers are what make your team go, and you've got to make sure that you've got them for the whole season doing what they do best. You're not out there having your pitcher throw 150 pitches every single start because that would burn them out. You want them to be wherever you want them to be for load management, and maybe load management is something NFL teams need to think of a little bit more. Maybe a team like the Packers can do something like that with Rashawn Gary. If you're going 4 deep like the Packers in theory are on the edge, what if you take a little bit off of Rashawn Gary's plate to really let him go in those situations where he can't? That's just an aside. Football theory, half-baked thoughts from Podcast Man. I mean, it's not my job on the line if my general manager decisions don't work, but it's something that I think teams got to think about a little bit. If you're going to try to maximize these players, what if maximizing them involves playing them a little bit less? Anyway, all that to say, expectations for Rashawn Gary are very high. The money, he's probably the best defender on the Packers right now. You probably could talk about Jair Alexander or Xavier McKinney being in that camp, or Kenny Clark, but it's probably Rashawn Gary. I'd be willing to listen to arguments. I might even believe some of them if you really wanted to argue passionately that it's Alexander or McKinney or Clark or whatever. But I think he's probably their best defender, so he's got to be that leader, metaphorically and actually. He's got to be the productive guy, the vocal leader, and I think really it comes down to replicating his first half success. Now, he's probably not going to be hitting 25, 30% pressure rate over the course of the entire season, as great as that would be. But just being that sort of consistent presence is what we need from Rashawn Gary this year, and I think he does it. I think this is a breakthrough season for Gary. I think he probably has the best shot with Hafley to find a role that really suits him on a week-in, week-out basis. I really thought that would have been Mike Pettin. I thought Pettin was more creative than he ended up being in Green Bay. Joe Barry, I think we've said enough about Joe Barry, but Hafley might be his best shot at finding a role that suits him really, really well. And I think he can do it, and I think he breaks through in a couple areas this year. I think we see 10-plus sacks out of Rashawn for the first time. He would have been there in 2022 except for his torn ACL. Probably should have been there last year except for tailing off a little bit down the stretch. But I think he breaks through this year. I think he makes the Pro Bowl this year, and I think, going out on a limb here a little bit, I think it's an all-pro season for Rashawn Gary this year. There's no reason that he can't do it. If things had broken a little bit differently in his career to date, he probably would have hit all of those things by now. I think this is the season where he gets all 3 of those things as the really unquestioned leader on this Packers defense. Rashawn Gary is the guy now and has to be it and play like it and just do what we know Rashawn Gary can do for the course of the entire season, and that's going to take the rest of this edge rusher group a long way. So I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you'd take a second and share this episode with somebody you think would enjoy it. It's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in this conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.